In this section of measurement, we're going to discuss the implementation of continuous measurement procedures. Continuous measurement measures all instances of target behavior during observation periods and detects all instances of behavior. Some of the different types of continuous measurements are frequency count, rate, duration, latency, and inner response time, also known as IRT. In the next few slides, I'm going to go over each different type of continuous measurement individually so you can see the difference between each of them. Before we go into specific types, let's quickly discuss what is continuous measurement. Continuous measurement measures all instances of a response that are observed during an observation period. When using continuous measurements, the best time to use this type of measurement is when the behaviors have a discrete beginning and ending. You do not want to use continuous measurements when behaviors are occurring at higher rates, such as hand flapping. For example, if your client is hand flapping at such a high rate, it may be too difficult to keep track of every single instance of behavior. So, let's continue our discussion on the different types of continuous measurements and which scenarios are best to use these measurements. Here we are going to talk about taking frequency data. When we're recording frequency, we are taking account of how many times a behavior occurs during an observation period. Data is recorded by using a tally count. It's the most clear and easiest way to count up your data after your observation period. Frequency is best used for behaviors that have a discrete beginning and ending. So for instance, kicking. We can observe a person kick another person and keep an exact count of each occurrence. A frequency count is the most common and straightforward way of collecting data. Let's take a look at the chart. Each column is a different date with a different staff for each behavior. By looking at the tallies, you are able to count up each behavior. Take a minute and on a separate sheet of paper, write down the total frequency of each target behavior for each day. Here are a few examples of frequency counts. John kicked the wall 5 times, so the frequency count is 5. Julie hit her sister 7 times, so the frequency count is 7. Matthew raised his hand 8 times. The frequency count is 8. In previous slides, we discussed the important materials that are needed when preparing to record data. For recording frequency, a writing instrument and data sheet is the most necessary materials needed to record frequency data. Depending on the client, some behavior analysts will give you a clicker to keep track of the frequency count, but a writing instrument and data sheet are the most common way of taking frequency data. Now we are going to move on to rate. Rate is the number of responses during a specific unit of time. For instance, per minute, per hour, per day. You are simply dividing the number count by time. The difference between frequency and rate is that frequency does not consider the time that was observed. If you look at the example, on Monday, there was an observation for 1 hour and it was observed that the client hit 5 times, and on Tuesday for 2 hours, the client hit 5 times. If we took a frequency count, there would not be a difference at all because it will show the number of occurrence, which would be 5. But if we looked at the rate for Monday, we would divide by 5 by 1 and get 5 occurrences of hitting per hour. And on Tuesday, we would divide 5 by 2 and get 2.5 occurrences of hitting per hour. There is a drastic difference between frequency and rate. When you are recording rate data, it is important to make sure your observation period is occurring for the correct amount of time. So make sure you are watching the clock or have a timer on hand. Once you start your time for your observation, you will then count all responses of the behavior you are targeting. When it is time to end the observation, you will stop recording your data. Depending on the frequency count, you will then divide by that number of response by the unit of time. Materials needed to collect rate data. You need instructions and operational definitions, instruments to track time, which could be a watch, a clock, or a timer, a writing instrument, and data recording sheet. Sometimes data is collected on an app or a device such as an iPad, a phone, or a tablet. Examples of rate. John spit 16 times in 2 minutes. Rate per minute. 15 divided by 2 equals 8 spits per minute. Julie hit her sister 40 times in 20 minutes. Rate per minute. 40 divided by 20 equals 2 hits per minute. Matthew put away 20 toys in 10 minutes. Rate per minute equals 20 divided by 10 equals 2 toys per minute. Duration is used to measure how long the response occurred. So for instance, you would use this for tantrums and out-of-seat behavior. If you look at the chart, there are different durations for each day for each behavior. Here are some examples of duration. John ran on the treadmill for 20 minutes. Julie had a tantrum for 12 minutes. Matthew read his book for 15 minutes. Duration could also be collected per session. So for example, during a half-hour session, the client engaged in a tantrum for 7 minutes, then another 3 minutes, then another 2 minutes. So the total duration would be 12 minutes. To collect data per session, you need to start your timer when the behavior begins. You need to stop the timer when the behavior ends. You do not need to restart the timer. Start it again when the behavior begins again. Stop the timer when the behavior stops, and continue until the observation session is completed. To measure duration per occurrence, you will use a timer to measure the length of time a behavior is occurring. So for example, the first time a child cried for 2 minutes, then the second time a child cried for 5 minutes, and then the child cried again for another 2 minutes. The total duration would be 9 minutes. Collecting duration data per occurrence. So the observer will start the timer when the behavior begins. The observer will stop the timer when the behavior stops. Observer will record duration for each instance of the behavior you're observing. Latency is measuring the time between an antecedent stimulus and the response. So simply, when you're delivering an SD to your client, the moment you're done delivering that SD, from the moment until your client answers, will be your latency time, the time in between. In the example given, the RBT says, touch your nose. It took the client 7 seconds to touch their nose. 7 seconds is the latency time. When you are recording latency data, the observer will start the timer once after the antecedent stimulus. The observer will stop the timer once the behavior occurs, and the observer will record latency time per response during the observation. When you are collecting latency data, it is important to read any instructions prior to teaching, as well as reading all operational definitions so you're aware of what to observe. A writing instrument and data sheet is again the most important to have ready ahead of time, and a clock, stopwatch, or any type of device to help measure time. In the next few slides, we are going to talk about inter-response time. Here you are measuring the time between two successful responses. The difference between IRT and latency is with IRT, you're focusing on responses, not so much the SD and response. The next slide will demonstrate some examples. So here are some examples for inter-response time. Julie engaged in vocal stereotypy at 1 o'clock, 1:05, 1:07, and 1:10. So the inter-response time between each of those behaviors is 5 minutes, 2 minutes, and 3 minutes, the time in between each successful behavior. All right, in another example, John kicked his peer at 2:50, 3:10, and then 3:40. So the inter-response time would be 20 minutes and 30 minutes, the time in between each behavior. When collecting inter-response time data, the observer will start the time at the end of one successful response. Then the observer will stop the timer at the beginning of the next successful response. That observer will report IRT between each successful response across the observation period. Materials needed to collect IRT data are exactly like the rest of the data types. You need instructions and operational definitions, writing instrument and data sheets, and a clock, a stopwatch, or a wristwatch, or any device to measure time.